Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about the movie The Last Dragon. So, when you got that glow, when you got that glow, good God, this soundtrack is going to get super glued into my noggin where I'm going to have to try for the next couple days to figure out other songs that are going to get those things out of there. God, does this movie have such a great soundtrack, but on top of that, it has a lot of great actors that are placed in the right position. And really, we have it to where a lot of these actors, I'm like, bravo to a lot of these choices. We end up having so many of these characters stand out in their best way possible. We end up having reasonably Eddie Arcadian, who is the villain in this story, who either by look or laugh or whatever, or intimidation or whichever, is just kind of a really amazing villain. And we end up having also, Sho'nuff, who is just really just a menacing character, but also at some points in time, like he's giving you, of course, just lines that you're gonna just be like, "Who's the master? Sho'nuff? Who's the baddest man in town? Sho'nuff." Uh, and really, we end up having also some really good music being delivered by Laura Charles in this movie, giving us Seventh Heaven and also just kind of giving us really a bulk of music that is being delivered with in this movie, which you can really just enjoy. Really, I like it to where we end up having Leroy, who is to eventually have his family seemingly having a pizza joint. And so we're like, oh, okay, so I understand that exactly. Like, I wonder if anybody Coming to America had actually put together a Leroy Green's pizza joint. Because I don't know how, like, I'd actually seen an actual McDowell's from Coming to America. So I'm assuming or assessing that eventually we were to eventually get like a Leroy's pizza joint, because I guess a lot of places are actually recreating some movie settings. I guess bizarrely to just get some kind of credit or something out there that is like, oh hey guys, we built the first one, we did it, like we made one. Um, Excuse me, because I know like movies from or movies from the Jay and Silent Bob films are actually going on to actually be actual locations. So going into this film, we end up really going and really having a very good soundtrack, but also we end up having also a film that also just gives us really cool action sequences and like fight scenes that I thought were kind of interesting still to this day, even with the kind of way of which that we have gone into now, where really fight scenes have gotten ridiculously overcomplicated. Really, I just kind of liked how kind of even simple a lot of these sequences were, where basically it's like, oh, well, hey, you fall down, right? It's like, yeah, I fall down. Because I know I'm not that of an experienced fighter compared to you, Bruce Leroy. Uh, we end up really having it to where I think in the very beginning of this film, I almost kind of think that this movie is a parody of itself. But then eventually I realized that there's so many characters that do stand out that it's like, well, wait a minute. This has probably got to be hands down, for me finally remembering this film and watching it and looking at it. I'm like, this has to be the most fun martial art movie. And really, maybe not every scene is perfect within this film, and it's not supposed to be. But you know what? I think that this is the most fun that you can have in a movie. and leave kind of very much well remembering a lot of the things going on into it, because you'll get some one liners and you'll get some music and you'll get some poignant thing that you remember this movie by for the rest of your life. And I think that's a very rare occurrence because really a lot of these movies just go through the blender of you just going like, oh, okay, I saw that. Like, let's move on to the next one. Who cares? Because that one isn't as, like, this movie isn't as good as whichever. And it would be kind of interesting to eventually find a person that actually has the movie The Last Dragon as their most favorite film of all time. Like, I would find that person just like, well, why exactly do you love this movie so much? It's like, well, I got into karate, or I really also heavily loved Bruce Lee movies, and this was just the thing that worked for me. Really, we end up having uh, really just some. Also, there was like a whole. Uh, uh, Episode of Up Up Down Down where we actually had the guy who ended up playing Leroy Green was actually on an episode of Up Up Down Down, and we ended up having the guy who was at the time Rusev, who is now Miro. He ended up talking with the guy that played Leroy Green, which I'm gonna try to pronounce his name. Um, Timok, Tiamak, Taimak. I'm going to ill pronounce that, so I apologize. So I'd rather just say Leroy Green or Blues. I keep wanting to say I can't say Bruce correctly today. Bruce Leroy evidently is his code name. Funny enough, we end up having a character who is to have the moniker of being able to catch a bullet with his teeth. I guess what is the story in the very beginning of this film. But yeah, we evidently have a karate like story where we are to eventually realize that it seems that this last dragon needs to be able to get to his next level of karate. And we end up having his teacher consistently telling him, dude, you're there. Like you're done. Like you're like there's nowhere you can go. There's no one who can teach you anything that you don't already know. And we end up having Leroy like still, but no, I still need that objective. I still need that next mission. I still need to learn something. And so we eventually have it to where Leroy needs to have that very next level that is going to finally get his whole entire body to seemingly glow when he is to attack a person. To where it seems that this ability for Leroy to glow is to have him have the ability to have anything possible after this point. Because really, when we have this kind of beginning sequence of Leroy doing all these miraculous things while he's training, and that just isn't clearly good enough, like we end up having almost Leroy having almost like superhuman abilities at some point, where we end up having Leroy who can almost kind of like have this kind of connection with things, and it's kind of like like it's kind of unsure of how exactly he can do this, but he just can. He just feels things. So going into this movie, it's kind of very hard to say any number of any of these people like really truly and stick out, because all of them are equally good at what they do. Even something as small as a guy named Rock, who is to basically be a failing boxer who is basically just now a henchman to Eddie Arcadian. We end up having also really just some interesting characters who eventually bring in some fun to this film. Uh, we end up having also Leroy's brother, who I believe is Richie Green, who is to kind of just really kind of be the real common sense to Leroy, where like Richie pretty much tells Leroy that it's like, well, hey, like, yeah, like, you know karate and all that, but you don't know how to, uh, like, you don't know how to make love to a woman. Like, you don't know how to, like, you don't know how to dance. You don't know how to, like, you don't know how to paint. You don't even have a brush there, buddy. And so, like, we end up having Leroy come to the consensus that he doesn't know anything besides actually just fighting karate and teaching people eventually how to do this thing called karate. So, with that said, yeah, that's kind of the real true road of which that we kind of go in here is we end up having Leroy, who is so much into a certain kind of culture or just really just Bruce Lee in general, to where we end up having Leroy kind of just mimicking and or copying Bruce Lee through a bulk of this film. Or we end up having Leroy coming up with some ideas because of a Bruce Lee film. So, with that said, I think that's all that I wanted to talk about this movie in a very cryptic like sense. Let's see who the master is and get into this review. Hopefully, I might not take way too much time to just kind of go over this film. Even though it's a really fun film, I really do enjoy it. I really didn't realize how good this movie was, but there's little nitpicky scenes that I could probably go on about and like, yeah, this scene, yeah, just just doesn't work that well. Like, but it's like it's really being a nitpicky like piece of crap to just go over and say like, oh well, this scene just like because overall the movie wins you over. It's a real fun movie. So with that said, I think it's about time to go into that spoiler territory of this movie because you're gonna find out who the master is, baby. I am. No. So it is spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So we have a very beginning sequence of people being in a movie theater, and all of a sudden we end up having a dance battle being broken out inside of a movie where people, I guess, have seen this movie so many numerous times that they have memorized the lines, and all of a sudden there's a dance battle going on within the theater, and we end up having a guy that is to basically run up on these two dancers and break their boombox by jumping on top of it with both of his feet and crushing the boombox. So we end up having seemingly this film to stop somewhere within this movie to have Sho'nuff and his goons arrive to basically tell everybody that I guess since they have seen a karate movie, that now they know everything about karate. So Sho'nuff wants to see if anybody is going to heckle the crap out of him or pick a fight with him, because why not do that in a actual theater of people that are coming to see a martial arts film? So we end up having, of course, having Sho'nuff coming on down. And here's the funniest thing. We end up having Eddie Arcadian, who is to call Sho'nuff Mr. Nuff in this movie. And I think that is the most hilarious thing to do. Like, I love that to pieces when we end up having, like, Eddie Arcadian who's like, yeah, me and Mr. Nuff. We were just minding our own business. And Thank you, Mr. Nuff. Like we're gonna try our best, Mr. Nuff. Oh my god. So going on to this, we end up having Sho'nuff, who is like, "Who's the baddest man in town?" And of course, everybody of Sho'nuff's gang is like, "Sho'nuff." We end up having Sho'nuff, who I guess is the Shogun of Harlem, and so we have it to where seemingly that Sho'nuff is to eventually go throughout this theater and pick out people who are eventually going to try and fight him, and we eventually have some takers and some people who are like, "Hey man, shut up! I'm trying to watch the theater movie thing," and so we end up having Sho'nuff who's like, "Well, come down here and shut me up then," and so we end up having certain people to fight out Sho'nuff to eventually easily get their claw cleaned. If someone is to even get a licking on Sho'nuff, we end up having them paying in dividends for him basically like almost like snapping and or breaking their freaking leg. So we end up having some kid saying, "Well, there's one guy that'll go up against you," and Sho'nuff is like, "Well, who is that? Show me where he is." And we end up having this kid who's like, "Yeah, it's over there. He's Bruce Leroy." And so we end up having Sho'nuff going like, "Oh, that guy? Well, I know about all these ghost stories that I keep hearing all around town about this guy catching bullets with his teeth and all kinds of other things. Like, I'm getting a little irritated with this guy. And you know what, Mr. Leroy, Bruce, whatever your name is, I want to put some boots into you." And so we end up having to where everybody starts to fight Sho'nuff and his gang. And so we end up having Leroy, who's to sneak out of this theater because he just wants to try and do a lot of things just in a non violent capacity. And so we end up having it to where we have Leroy, who is to eventually go and showcase his home. I'm kind of maybe skipping around. I don't know exactly where everything kind of ends the way it does. So I'm just kind of going into this route about doing this movie. So we end up going along and having Leroy showcasing his home life to have us see that Leroy seems to be very different from the rest of his family, from the rest of the Greens. We end up having both the dad and the father of this home, who are just kind of regular mom and dads and stuff like that. And we end up having Richie, who is complaining about Leroy and how he's like, "Man, he wears goofy clothes and like he looks like Bruce Lee all the time, and like this kid is just weird." And we end up having both Leroy's father and mother just kind of going like, "Well, yeah, so he's weird, so what?" So we end up having eventually Leroy is to eventually go to his master, to his teacher. And so we end up having it to where we end up having Leroy doing this training session, and we end up having this master, his trainer, who is to shoot arrows at Leroy, to where we end up having Leroy, who ends up chopping an arrow in half. If that's not a good enough task, we end up having Leroy, who is eventually going on to do this weird, bizarrish move to this mannequin. And when the teacher is to fire yet another arrow, we end up having Leroy, who is to catch it in the air. And I guess we end up having this teacher who is very impressed by by Leroy catching the right colored arrow, because I guess he was supposed to catch the blue arrow. And so we end up having the teacher going like, wow, like, how did you know that it was the blue arrow you were supposed to catch? He's like, well, like, I just felt like he had some bizarre like sixth sense or force power or something that told him that this arrow was blue. So we end up having uh, Leroy Sensei, I guess that's the more better term, ripping off his dragon logo upon his shirt. And we have Leroy who is bowing because he thinks that he had done something wrong. And his teacher is like, and his sensei is like, no, you've done something right. You have completed your training. There is nothing more that I can teach you besides you going out there and realizing that there is another level that you will probably never obtain, but eventually still need to get to, which is just the great beyond, which is just basically like you need to die right now. No, the great beyond meaning just being that Leroy now needs to basically just get a life. Just get a life, Leroy, and then you'll feel completely whole. You'll just get the glow when you realize that you now have a life, Leroy. You spent years upon years practicing karate, but now you just need to get a girlfriend and a brother that can accept you for who you are, and you just having to beat the crap out of certain people along the way. You know what I'm saying? So we end up having Leroy just going like, well, but how do I get to this next level? Like Leroy's on a mission that he has to complete, and we end up having reasonably Leroy Sensei having no real true answer to that. And so we end up having this sensei giving Leroy some master to go to. And so we end up having eventually Leroy is going on his way to eventually go to this master. And so we end up having it in the very beginning of this film that Leroy is to get a Bruce Lee medallion that Leroy is supposed to hold dear. And so we end up going on to having us showcase a show called Seventh Heaven, which is to be some show, some MTV like thing where we end up having this talent, Laura Charles, giving us this Seventh Heaven experience with these people dancing and singing, and we end up having Laura, who is to give us the theme song of this show, I would suggest. And so we end up having to, I guess, this Seventh Heaven is really a really popular like show to where everybody is trying to go and desperately try to get to one of the tapings of the show so they can see it. So we seemingly also have a character called Eddie Arcadian who is to desperately try and get his woman that he is with, Angela Veracco? 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 Sure. We end up having Angela, who is to put together also these songs and to put together these music videos. And so we end up having Eddie wanting these videos of Angela's to be put on to this show called Seventh Heaven so Eddie can start making money off of Angela. And so we end up having it to where Eddie is to watch this Seventh Heaven show and he's like, yeah, like this is like the like if we end up having Angela making it, like, on this show, like, she'll be able to make it anywhere. And so we end up having, of course, that Eddie is just kind of talking about how reasonably Angela needs to get on the show, and we end up having also Eddie's sidekick, Rock, who's complaining about, like, well, hey, man, like, why are you pushing her, like, so much to, like, be able to get on the show, but hey, uh, you didn't push to get me to another title shot. And we end up having Eddie, who's like, well, like, Rock, like, you fought the champ and you lost. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? Like, there's only so much that I could do with a person of of your ability. Like, it's not my fault. So we had Eddie, who is to eventually try and persuade Laura Charles to give her the best dining experience possible, uh, to try to win her over by giving her the most lavish restaurant to go to give her a really good pitch. And so we end up having Eddie's people talking to Laura's people. And so we end up having, of course, a guy who is by the name of JJ, who is to talk to Laura Charles and to mention about Eddie and that they desperately want Angela's videos to be played on Seventh Heaven, and Laura Charles is completely disinterested. To where really JD is kind of really pushing this, and Laura's like, no, I want nothing to do with this. So when we have Eddie, who is to basically hear the news that Laura is completely disinterested with anything that Eddie has to offer, he's like, well, there's an answer for that too. We end up having, of course, Eddie, who is to go and basically kidnap Laura, to where I guess she does not actually, like, uh, call the police on any of this. She just lets Leroy do what he does and just calls it a day. So we end up having Laura, who is to go into her car and realize that it seems to be not her regular driver. And so we end up finding out that Laura is to eventually go and have to forcibly be driven to somewhere, to where she ends up having to be taken by these men. We end up having, of course, Leroy showing up and trying to take down these men and then eventually vanish, like, of course, Batman would. And we end up having Leroy, who accidentally leaves his medallions for Laura to pick up. To where eventually we have Leroy, who needs to desperately find Laura again because he thinks that she has his medallions, which of course she does, luckily. So we end up having it to where we have of course, Eddie that realizes, oh my god, Laura had slipped from our fingers. Well, there's an answer for that. So, we have, I guess, bizarrely, Rock, who's to put a rack of lamb or something into this piranha pond where we're seeing these piranha, like, go after this, to kind of showcase to us that it seems like this little aquarium is going to be in use sometime in the near future, to just kind of talk about how they've wanted to get rid of this piranha aquarium, but eventually, like, there was some good use out of it, which is to have this be a sequence for seemingly seconds of a movie of eventually Eddie getting dunked into this thing Bromley just getting wet. You got all wet. So we end up having it to where we have Eddie, who is to have Rock go and uh, disguise himself as some TV crew to have Laura come into this van to have Rock grab her and take her to uh, Eddie Arcane's headquarters. And so we end up eventually having Leroy, who is to try to find Laura, because Leroy ends up making it to. He ends up making it to uh, Laura's seventh heaven with Richie on his side. And so we end up having Richie, who ends up actually sneaking into seventh heaven with his friends, and we end up having Leroy, who's just kind of waiting it out for this seventh heaven show to be over, so that way he can possibly talk with Laura. And so we end up having Laura, who ends up getting kidnapped yet again, to where we end up having Leroy, who ends up seeing a clipboard that ends up saying the words Eddie Arcadian Production, and so Leroy's like, I gotta figure out where this is. So we have Laura, who is to be tied up within Eddie Arcadian's humble abode, where we end up having Eddie, who is to basically mention to Laura, it's like, you need to watch every little bit of this video and tell me exactly what you feel about this song. And we end up having Laura, who's like, yeah, I'm never going to put this on my Seventh Heaven show. Like, I don't think that it's the right song for me to have this being on Seventh Heaven. And so we end up having it to where, like, Eddie is really just, like, so disappointed at this point. And so we eventually end up having Leroy, who ends up making his way into Eddie Arcadian's headquarters. And of course, we end up having some, of course, extra like guys, just police officers, whoever that I guess Eddie had paid off, to eventually just have Leroy just take them down within one or two punches or whatever, or one good sling or whichever, hit them and be done with it. To where we end up having eventually Leroy is to grab Eddie and dunk him into the piranha tank to make him all wet. To where we end up having of course Leroy, who is to grab Laura and to have Laura get Leroy's medallion. So we end up having Leroy, who is to basically tell Laura his life story while this whole thing is to go on. We're basically like telling him who he is and yada yada yada. So we end up having Leroy, who is to eventually get his medallion, but then is eventually realizing how late it is. And so we end up having Leroy, who ends up, of course, bowing to Laura and then ends up leaving. So we eventually have Leroy, who is, of course, teaching his students how to be karate people. And so we end up having Sho'nuff showing up at Leroy's dojo to just be like, well, hey, man, like, we want to come in here for some lessons. Like, we want to learn a thing or two from Leroy Green, of all people. And so we end up having it to where Leroy is trying to non-violently get Sho'nuff to go away. And so Sho'nuff is like, well, hey, like, I guess you aren't the baddest man in town, so how about you go and you kiss my Converse? How about you bow down to me, 'cause I am just your better? So we have it to where Sho'nuff's goons are trying to force uh, Leroy to bow down, and he won't do it. To where we eventually have a uh, another guy who is to jump into the fray to basically showcase that you don't actually have to win a fight by even fighting. It's like you just gotta look really cool, look really intimidating, and do a bunch of wow and all this other stuff, like this big, like elaborate thing, and someone will just run off. No, like we have this guy who tries this and he ends up getting kicked in the face, and we end up having this guy trying this yet again to just get again basically just kicked in the face and throttled. So we end up having eventually Leroy having to forcibly kiss Sho'nuff's Converse to uh like I'm really trying to look for uh the actual the actual name of the actual guy who is the person who ends up doing the bizarrish uh anyways, it's a moot point. So going on into here, we end up having Leroy who is to go on to this factory that has these guys who are going out and mouthing and lip syncing this song. And so we have these two guys, these factory workers, who eventually have Leroy come in and ask, like, hey, like, I'm here to speak to your master. And we end up having them going, like, hey, like, dude, we don't, this master is not here. And Leroy's like, no, I think you're lying to me. There has to be a master here. And we end up having these factory workers that are like, I don't think he gets it. Like, how about I speak to him in his voice or his words, and to where it's like, Master, no here, chop chop, move your butt out of here, chop chop, like, or whatever, like get out of here. And so we end up having Leroy, who just kind of feels defeated that he can't get into this headquarters to find this master. And so we end up having it to where Leroy, of course, has to forcibly leave because this master was supposed to help Leroy get this glow. And so we end up having eventually Leroy speeding up this whole process. We end up having Leroy who ends up going back to that area because we end up having Laura who ends up asking Leroy to be her bodyguard because she needs someone to protect her body. And so we end up having Leroy who's kind of like, yeah, you know what, I'm kind of busy. Like, I don't think I'll have the time to protect your body, even though how slamming it is. Like, I just don't think that I'll have the time on my hands. Because we have it to where Richie is like, dude, like, you wouldn't even know what to do with it if you got that, like, slice of pie, if you know what I'm saying. And so we end up having Leroy who is to go on with Laura because Laura wants to show him something. And so we end up having Leroy who is to go with Laura to mention how that he or his friend has this problem with with painting, that he thinks that he wouldn't be able to pick up a pencil or a brush, or he wouldn't be able to actually even draw. And Laura is like, what are you even talking about? And he's like, the art. The art of making love. I don't think that my friend, I mean, would be able to do anything like that. And so Laura is just like, ha 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 ha. Like, maybe he's interested in me. Like, well, he is good looking and all, but. So we end up having Laura, who's to bring Leroy to Seventh Heaven, because we end up having Leroy, who is to talk about that he is not interested in being Laura's bodyguard, because he ends up he needs to go to this master to find out about this glow that is going to give him the best ability of being the best at karate. And so we end up having Laura, who ends up playing him a package of Bruce Lee uh, movie clips and playing the song about when you got that glow. Basically the theme song of this movie for the most point, with the exclusion of "You Are the Last Dragon." I don't know the rest of the song of most of these songs, but I just remember that "You Are the Last Dragon." That's all that I remember because it's the song. Anyways, so we end up having Laura, who is to go on to show Leroy this package, and package sounds weird, and they end up kissing and continuing to kiss, because eventually we have some footage where Bruce Lee is kissing some woman, so Leroy's like, well, I guess I should plant one on this woman. But then eventually we end up having Leroy seeing a Bruce Lee movie where he's realizing that, hey, this is how I can ambush these guys to otherwise get into this factory to get to this master. And so Leroy just ends up booking it for Eddie Arcadian to see, like, hey, this is my time to pounce. I should go after Laura yet again to kidnap her. Not only that, but also we end up having Richie, who is starting to see Leroy going after his woman. And so we end up having Richie, who is to eventually call Leroy a coward once Sho'nuff ends up destroying the Leroy Green's pizza place. And we end up eventually having Richie, who is to call Laura his woman right in front of her, and to basically say that Leroy isn't the right guy for Laura, because Leroy doesn't know a thing or two about life. He just knows karate, and that's all he knows. And so we end up having it to where we have both Richie and Laura, who are to be tied up to be in this seventh heaven, to where we end up having Eddie, who is to go and now get the highest hitters to go after Leroy. He's paying a lot of people off one by one to eventually go after Leroy and clean house. And so we end up having, of course, Sho'nuff even getting paid off, and Sho'nuff is like, dude, like, keep your money. Like, if anything, just like name the time and place, and I'll be there, and I'll take care of them. And so we end up having, of course, so Leroy ends up going off to go to this headquarters that he needs to sneak into, and he sneaks in there as a pizza man. But we end up having it to where, of course, Leroy tries to recycle some of the rapping that he did with Richard before to try and to get into Seventh Heaven. Like, what it be, what it look like, what it is. And so we end up having, bizarrely, Leroy going through a different barrage of different kind of voices. Like, what it is, what it look like, or what it is, what it look like. And then, like, Leroy just settles on his normal voice. So we end up having these guys who are to have Leroy come in here with a pizza that is, I guess, for this master. And these guys are like, dude, like, this guy will not give up. So we end up having it to where they end up playing a dice game. And we have these guys that eventually just outsmart Leroy to where eventually Leroy is just kind of kicked out of this factory yet again. So we end up having Leroy who just busts through the door. He's like, tell me where your master is. Tell me now. To where we end up having these guys sending Leroy to this thing that is just a machine. There is no real master here. There is nobody giving any real fortune cookie knowledge here. And so we end up having Leroy going back to his original sensei, and he's like, hey, like, you sent me on a wild goose chase, and it's because the master, like, the sensei is like, well, yeah, I did that for a good reason, because if anything, like, the only thing that you need to figure out is what's inside here, your heart, that'll tell you that you are good enough. Like, you, like, don't need a fortune cookie to tell you that you are the best. You just are. And you're not getting that. You're not, like, you're not getting that you are basically, with karate, done. And until you get that, like you're just gonna keep being where you are. Not having this real, like, we have it to where, like, this is a whole, like, a riddle within itself, or really just a kind of conundrum of sorts, or just kind of like a thing that Leroy has to come to the consensus or understand that he is already there, and no one needs to tell him that he's the best, because he should know it himself. He should already believe in himself and say who is the best. He is. So we have Leroy, who is to go on to eventually have it to where he needs to show up at Seventh Heaven. And so we end up having Leroy, who is to show up to face these villainous people, and we seemingly end up having Angela, who is to try and tell Leroy that he should stay away from Eddie Arcadian. I'm going to pause here for a second. And so we end up getting this message being passed along to... I had to reset for a second. We end up having this message being passed along, and so we end up having Leroy, who is to eventually go to Seventh Heaven with only himself, and because he ends up actually locking one of his proteges in a weapons case. So we end up having Tay, who is actually the guy from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, as a kid in this movie. And we end up also finding out within this film that Tay ends up actually fighting his own father in this movie, which, like, the last person he ends up actually fighting is actually his father in this film, which I kind of thought that was kind of fun to kind of see that, to where, like, this kid's own father is actually his villain, which I thought was kind of funny. Like, yeah, make your son look good in this movie. Eventually he'll get on to be in Ninja Turtle movies, and he'll be successful. The Rundown and so on and so forth. A lot of other Rush Hours and so on and so forth. Barely in Rush Hour, but still, he was in Rush Hour. So we end up having Leroy, who is to go on to Seventh Heaven to eventually have Eddie Arcadian controlling the Seventh Heaven, and having this menacing appearance of Eddie Arcadian in here going, Leroy, Leroy, Leroy. You're gonna die, Leroy. I've sent a number of hired goons out to get you. And so we just have a barrage of all these people just coming out of the woodwork, like as if it's like the end of the very first Mortal Kombat movie, where we end up having all these people just popping out of nowhere, where they're either uh, really good at like being these powerhouse like characters that are just gonna fling Leroy around or do some kind of suplex or some kind of slam of sorts that end up kind of hurting Leroy for a brief moment of time, but Leroy is also going to just outmuscle some of these people. Even at some point, we end up having Leroy with some nunchucks, and one of the characters actually like eats the nunchucks and chucking it off to the side. So we end up having it to where Leroy is having a hard time going and fighting all of these characters, but we end up having Leroy's backup coming in because Tay ends up rescuing um, Leroy's protege to go out onto I think his name is Johnny. I think his name is Johnny. And so we end up having Tay and Johnny going and getting all the other karate students to all come out to help Leroy fight all of these people. To where we just see this onslaught of just all these people getting beaten up, all these villains getting beaten up by all these karate kids. So we end up having eventually Johnny, who is to eventually get his ability to actually fight people, as well as Tay. I think that's his name. Yeah. Tay, who is to eventually also just start clocking people as well. And so we end up having it to where we are to have, of course, Leroy, who is to have Richie start getting like out of his ropes, and we have both Leroy and Richie who are to try to get to Laura. And so we end up having, of course, Richie who ends up getting accidentally knocked out or just kind of a little concussed or something. And so we end up having Leroy who ends up taking out a goon. And so we end up having Leroy finding Richie and protecting him by putting him into some locked room, to where eventually Leroy is to go on to, instead of actually getting to Eddie, he ends up instead having to fight Sho'nuff. So we end up having, of course, that Sho'nuff is to eventually reveal that he has the glow. And so we end up having, of course, Leroy getting his clock just cleaned, to where we have Sho'nuff who is just beating the living crap out of Leroy, sadly. And eventually he's getting knocked all over the place. And we end up having, of course, Sho'nuff repetitiously asking Leroy, like, who is the master? And Leroy's like, no, I'm not going to give it to you. I'm not going to bow to you. I'm not going to say your name. Nope, not happening. I don't care if I die. So we eventually get on to eventually Sho'nuff just finding this little thing to just start dunking Leroy repetitiously into this water, to where we end up having Eddie watching over this, and he's like, yeah, drowned him. And so we end up having Sho'nuff consistently dunking Leroy, asking him the same question, who's the master? To eventually we end up having Leroy, who finally, after this, of course, slow motion backup, and to where Leroy's like, I'm going to ask you one more time, who is the master? And Leroy's like, I am. Because we have Leroy who consistently keeps getting dunked, to have his entire life flash before his eyes, to realize that all the people are believing in him, and that his master, like, something finally clicked with what he had said. So that there is no more anything for Leroy to learn, but to learn that he needs to believe in himself. So Leroy's like, I am. So we end up having, of course, having Sho'nuff punching Leroy to where Leroy, of course, catches his fist and then starts twisting and turning and breaking Sho'nuff's hands. To where we end up seeing, of course, the Bruce Lee moment, to where Leroy is doing the hand kind of shifts, to where we are starting to see multiple hands appear, and Eddie's like, "Oh crap!" He's like, "Oh rat!" And we have Eddie, who is watching on as Leroy is to just start beating the living crap out of Sho'nuff, just start flinging him around, doing all these kinds of moves, dunking him into the exact same waters of which that Leroy was in, to the point to where Sho'nuff is now just like almost drowning in this water, to where Leroy has to pick him up out of this spot to have him like not actually drowned into the water. So we end up having Eddie, who's like, dude, I am done with all this. Like, I'm done with all these kicking and punching, and you know what? How about we settle things the old-fashioned way, by a way of the bullet? And so we end up having, of course, Eddie, who is to fire a gun into Leroy, to where we have Leroy, who's like, what? And so we end up having Leroy, who, of course, is to get shot. He is to die. That is the way this movie sadly ends. And so we have it to where really just Laura Charles is just weighing over the dead body of Leroy, and she's like, no! And that's how the movie just ends, sadly. There is no happy ending for this movie. No, that's not what happens at all. So we end up having, of course, Leroy, who is to be turned over by Eddie to showcase that he had actually caught the bullet with his teeth, of course, like he had done before, supposedly by Sho'nuff. And so we end up having, of course, now Leroy, who is, of course, having the fear of God being put by Eddie Arcadian. And so we end up having Leroy just hoisting Eddie into some little like hook concoction, to where Leroy is kind of boostering Eddie up to where his feet are no longer touching the ground, to where we end up having the police coming into the fray, and we end up having Eddie, who is to mention like, hey, me and Mr. Nuff were just like kind of just walking by, and all of a sudden this thug, this Leroy character, like, he was putting the boots to us. He was hurting us pretty badly. Like, it was kind of funny that eventually Leroy ended up taking out of all of Eddie's goons, and then Eddie's goons ended up mentioning that it was like, 20, 30 guys with like bats and knives and all kinds of craziness. Like, we had to give it up to them. But anyways, we end up having Eddie, who is to eventually run off with Laura to eventually like have, or no wait, not even that, because we end up having Laura, who is to have her camera crew and all kinds of people like telling Laura like, what are you doing here? Like, aren't you like, shouldn't you be like doing a show here in just minutes? Like, what are we gonna do with this? And so we end up having this Seventh Heaven, who now ends up turning into, a bunch of these karate kids are now dance fighters, because we end up having these kids switch over to be dancers. And so we end up having it to where, since everything is now beaten and done and whatever, we end up having Leroy, who has to do the one last thing that he needs to learn how to do, is to learn some moves. So we have Leroy, who ends up bringing in some flowers into this establishment to try and shout out to Laura that he needs to learn some moves. And Laura's like, huh? And immediately when the music stopped, we end up having, of course, Leroy, who shouts this whole thing out to the heavens, to where everyone hears and everybody's laughing at him, to where Laura is just like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to come down to you and show you some moves. And so we end up having like people giving Richie some crap about his brother, and Richie's like, like he's the master, and you know what, like he's like he beats everybody, he beats the crap out of everyone, so like I'm not gonna have a negative thing to say about him anymore. Like he's basically like number one, and so he's kind of won me over with being Laura's man. So like we end up having Laura, who is eventually vanish with Leroy, and that's how this movie is just to end. I find this movie to just be so much fun. I kind of skipped around about the whole, I think Angela thing, the singer character that kind of eventually goes back to Kew Gardens and kind of dumps Eddie Arcadian. I kind of skipped about that because I don't feel like that's really important. But there's also probably a thing here or there that I probably skipped around about, like when Sho'nuff was actually going into the Leroy's Pizza Parlor and like starting to just destroy things in there, even to where some of the stuff that Leroy was, it wasn't actually his. The people were destroying. Then eventually, Richie was getting dunked into this trash can. Eventually, having Leroy come back to the pizza place to be called a coward and any number of other things by Richie. So yeah, I think I kind of covered everything within this movie. I think there was probably no stone probably left unturned. I really enjoyed this movie. It was really fun, just because I think the actors and the music sells this movie more than anything else. Uh, because I don't know, like the story, like I don't know exactly if it 100% sells me, but I think just uh, the actors, how unique they all are, and how like really just individually that they can just impress a person is good enough to just sell you on this movie. So, with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.